Hello, welcome. Um, Thanks everyone for already sharing in the chat and saying hello. As always, there is never any pressure to introduce or share in the chat, but we welcome it if you would like to. So if you want to share where you're joining from or what brings you here, please feel free. I see a question from Aaron. Is this webinar free? Yes, it's free. So glad that you are here and found the link one way or the other and was able to join. And looks like we have folks joining from many different places. Looks like we have a lot of people joining with their own losses and some folks who are professionals. So thanks to everyone who has come together tonight. And I really quickly will just introduce myself in case anyone doesn't know me. I'm Litsa. I'm a clinical social worker, grief therapist, and one of the co-founders of What's Your Grief. And this webinar series is a monthly series that we do that is connected with our Griever Hub, which is a membership space that is for grief support that goes beyond kind of just traditional support groups and offers education and creative expression and other sorts of outlets for exploring grief. But these webinars are things that we open up to anybody, whether you're a member of the Hub or not, because it allows us a space to dive into topics that have maybe been coming up in other discussion spaces in the Hub, but we know oftentimes are things that people who are grieving may be thinking about and not had a space to learn about or explore or think about. So that's just a little context for this series. This topic tonight is really a broad umbrella topic, new awareness of old losses, right? This is, I think, really a theme that we hear so often from people in grief and have experienced so deeply ourselves, those of us who are on the team at What's Your Grief. And even though I think we know that this is a phenomenon, that if you have lived through any sort of loss, you know that the way it unfolds is that we go back and we revisit our losses, that sometimes our losses are very, very close to the surface, even though they are very old losses. And sometimes those losses maybe feel a little quieter. Some of you know, if you're members of the Hub, that I was just on vacation for a couple of weeks, and I met this woman who, in the way that happens when you sort of open up and share anything about grief, sometimes it gives other people the permission and space to open up. And she has lived all over the world. She's born in Germany, but has lived many different places. And we were just talking about different cultural understandings about grief and her own experience with grief. And she said, you know, the way I always think about grief is I think of it like a kitten. And she said, you know, when you first get a kitten, just like with grief, like you feel like you can't control it and it is constantly scratching you and it's all over you and you can't quite figure out sort of what to do with this kitten, and it demands all of your attention. And then slowly, as kittens become cats, they sort of shift and their personalities remain the same, but maybe they don't require quite as much of your attention. They don't scratch you quite as often. They're not as consuming. They start to sleep a little bit more. And when they are awake, they still demand your attention, and they may, run around the room. But that it sort of has this shift. And it was funny because I feel like I've heard 1 zillion grief analogies in the many, many years I have done this work, but I've never heard someone describe their grief as a kitten that grows into a cat. But it seemed relevant today in this idea of thinking about new awareness of old losses, because no matter how old that grief cat might be and how many hours a day it might sleep, there are so many reasons that we have moments where that cat wakes up and it is as present as ever, and it is demanding all of our attention, and it is right back kind of on our laps. But it is also this companion in a way that I think many of us who have sat with losses that have been around for many, many, many years may know that it is a companion that becomes familiar and is always has the pain and the difficulty and the all of the things that come with it, but also holds all of the comfort of the memories and love and connection to the person. So today, in the way we're going to talk about this topic, I really want us to keep in mind that one of the biggest challenges when we think about new awareness of old losses, and when I see this come up for people, if I'm working with them individually in therapy, or if I have seen this in friends and in myself and in other people, is that oftentimes we feel many, many levels of questioning and almost a self-judgment about why things are surfacing with such intensity, even as time has passed. And I think this is really, really deeply intertwined with the beliefs that we have, not just about how grief is supposed to unfold and sort of the ways that we maybe have internalized from a very, very young age, this idea that if we're grieving, we're supposed to be moving forward somehow and getting a little bit better every day, and maybe recovering from grief the way you recover from a cold. And we kind of have these internalized messages that we receive from other people. That's certainly part of it. But that in general, we just have a deeply ingrained idea in modern Western society about linear progress. This is something that is baked into our culture, our modern Western society. The messages that we receive, not just about grief, but about how we exist in the world, about how we move through time, about the way that things are supposed to unfold. And this love of all things linear, our way of seeing the world through this linear lens, I think really, really shapes our openness to understand how and why old losses are continually resurfacing for us, and how we are willing or able to engage with it and show ourselves care in it and show ourselves understanding and compassion when these moments arise. So I am not going to bore you with kind of the whole history of this kind of linear way of seeing the world that is baked into our society. But I do think it's so important that we at least take a minute to remember, as we think about this topic today, how how deeply ingrained this is, and how if we want to make some movement in the way that we understand how losses and grief kind of continue to cycle and come up for us, and why we go back and we revisit, and it's a back and forth event, that we sometimes have to push back on really fundamental ideas of that we've been taught about the way the world works, about the way healing works, about the way grief works. And when we look at the modern Western framework, sorry, typo right there on my slide, of linear thinking, we know it is in the way we think of modern calendars, narrative arcs, which something, if you follow our writing at What's Your Grief, we have written about before, the concepts of progress. There's lots of scholarly thought that goes back and looks at how this idea of a very linear way of looking at the world and progress and moving through things, where it developed, and how it comes out of Judeo-Christian's idea about temporality, about sort of thinking about time in a very particular way that looks at before and an after and a future coming. Enlightenment philosophy, industrial capitalism, all of these things really create a way of thinking about time and movement through time and progress, that we take as a given, but that really contrasts with many cyclical and relational understandings of the world that come out of non-Western traditions, that come out of Celtic traditions, that come out of many other approaches historically and currently. And this, I think, when we think about this linear progression of how we maybe came to eventually see things like throughout the 1900s, grief being described as something that happened in stages, or something that we pictured in a place that had this nice narrative arc of coming to a place of what people often discussed as letting go or moving on or acceptance, or all of those things. We can see in many of the ways that just narrative structures are told, that stories are told, going all the way back to Aristotle. There was this very clear idea of how narrative is supposed to be told, with what feels very familiar to us, this rise of action, and then a climax and a resolution, that there's this cause and effect type of logic that is often a big part of the way we understand the world and tell stories in modern Western culture. It is this plot paradigm that makes things like the hero's journey feel very familiar to us, where we feel like we're going to kind of move through things, and we're going to go through the difficult parts, and it's going to be really hard, and then we're going to get to a place of resolution that feels like an end point. And so for many of us, that, because it is so common, because it is the story, the structure of the stories we've been told since our early childhood, it's what we start to impose on expectations about our own life. We think, if this is the way we see stories told around us, this is how my story will unfold. This is what it means for life to unfold and for us to go through difficult events. It's sort of, we have the event, we go through the hardest things early on and at the beginning, and then we get to this place that looks like resolution. And this really is the tradition out of which the grief work models, which are all those models of of grief that people may be familiar with, that things like the 5 stages of grief, that came out of an idea that, first of all, was rooted in our idea of time moving forward in a very, very traditional linear path where we're moving from the past to the future, and we go through, years, months, days, hours, minutes. We're thinking about time in that way, and it is constantly moving forward. So we think of it as sort of a road or a path that is moving us from past into the future in a very forward direction. And that idea was very much layered on our idea of what healing and emotional healing looks like in modern mental health. We conceptualize progress as rooted in some of these ideas of grief moving through in a progression, that, at least in the early days, luckily this has shifted in how modern mental health thinks of grief, but that thought about this idea of moving from attachment to detachment. This idea that we were moving to a place of being free of grief or resolving grief or recovering from grief, that was an idea that was baked into these narratives, that there was this idea that we, in order to work on our grief, that we had to do this psychological work that was active, progressive mental labor that was sort of unfolding over time. We'd work, and then we'd get to this place where our grief would somehow be resolved. And in some variations of that, it also meant that there was some version of feeling like we had to let go of the past in order to move forward into the future. Now, the good news is that, of course, modern mental health, and if you spent any time around What's Your Grief, you certainly know, has moved well beyond these ideas and has gone back to try to sort of correct some of these misconceptions that were part of the early ways that we conceptualized grief. But it doesn't mean it's not still deeply baked into the way our society thinks about grief, and the messages that we absorbed from an early age, and the messages we may hear from other people. So we still may have those feelings of questioning and self-judgment and wondering and, not being sure how to make space to talk about and process it, when suddenly things that other people in our life may think, well, shouldn't that be resolved? Isn't that long in the past? Isn't all of these old losses shouldn't be surfacing again, or shouldn't be so present for someone. They're rooted in this idea that somehow we hit a resolution or an endpoint, and that these things, even in that belief, of course, that will always be with us, still we may have that self-judgment of, why has it come up so intensely? Or why is it something where it really did feel like I spent a lot of time on certain issues and certain things, maybe in therapy, or I worked on this, I journaled about it, I came to a place where I felt like I really felt at peace about a certain aspect of that relationship or about the loss itself. And then suddenly it rears its head many, many years later, and we start asking these questions like, what does this mean? I didn't really resolve that I didn't really do all that work I thought I did, that I tricked myself into thinking this. So even when we maybe have that belief that, of course, our losses are always going to be with us, and that is part of the ongoing nature of grief, still sometimes when it comes up with an intensity we didn't expect, or in a way we didn't expect, or in an area that we felt like we'd already kind of spent time with and done work around, we may have a lot of these judgments that tie back to a lot of these different beliefs in how we approach things. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the common ways that comes up. But before we do, I think it's really helpful to think about, oh, I wonder why this isn't sharing properly. That's strange. Why to think about, what if we've really been focused in these linear progression ways of thinking about the world, about healing, about grief, about progress. What are the alternatives? I think one thing we have talked about many times in this series and in our writing is the many new grief theories that don't use linear models. They don't use phases or stages or tasks, but focus more on things like ongoing and continued connections. This idea that we have continued bonds with those that we have lost. The idea of the dual process model of grief, which says that we're kind of always in a state of oscillation where we're bouncing back and forth between tending to our loss, rebuilding our lives, that it's not a straight progression, but that we're kind of moving through these different things. But I think very importantly, and maybe in a more fundamental way than just those grief theories, when we think about why old losses continue to come up for us, how they come up for us, and how we can best be in relationship with those moments when it happens, and how we can have understanding for ourselves when we do, I think it can be really valuable to reflect on just the other ways of thinking about time and healing and progress, that things that don't necessarily focus on that traditional linear arc. And when we look at different traditions outside of Western traditions or pre-modern Western Judeo-Christian traditions, we see so many other ways of people understanding time, and many of them are deeply rooted in the idea of cycles. So some of those are certainly calendars and approaches that focus not on a linear progression of time, but instead really focus on time as something cyclical and connected to the cycles of nature and a movement through those cycles year over year, and a connection to ourselves as beings that are also moving through cycles. Structural ideas of time come out of cultures that really ground time in our relational and societal roles, that think about time in life phases or relationships and connections that aren't necessarily in a consistent linear progression, but that evolve in lots of different ways. And so time has this quality that is connected to our relationships. And we just see that there are many, this is only a handful, but there are many different cultures that use cyclical ideas of time, and often spiraling ideas of time that we'll talk about in a moment, that I think can be really helpful when we think about how and why old losses surface, when they do, and how we approach them. One way I like to think about this, or I find helpful to think about this, is imagining if we think about moving to somewhere where the cycles of the natural and world and the seasons look very different than where we come from and are used to. If I have grown up in a really tropical climate and I move suddenly very far north in Canada, and I'm now in a climate where I'm facing winters in a way that I've never had to face that before. That first winter, there is a good chance is going to be absolutely brutal. It is going to be an incredibly difficult winter because it is unlike anything I have ever experienced before. And as I move through that winter and then the next and the next, as each of those seasons goes on, I'll be learning things about myself, learning things about what it means to be in a world that experiences the deep depths of winter that I've never experienced before. I'll be figuring out ways of coping and surviving and doing things in the world that help me to get through this winter. And as I continue to live in that place, the winters are never going to go away, but I'll continue each time that winter comes back around again to understand it more, to know more things about what to do for myself during that season, about how to take care of my house and my mental well-being and my car and all of those things to be able to get through it. So there is this way in which I'm continuing to cycle through these seasons of this place that are ongoing. And yet I'm still sort of progressing just in a different way, right? My progress is coming through integrating that experience and learning what I need to be able to weather that particular season. And I think this can be a really helpful way, or at least for me, I have found it to be a helpful way to think about how we move through seasons of life in so many different ways that will bring our old losses very close to the surface again, that will really bring us to a place where we're now revisiting things from sometimes many, many, many years ago for different reasons. And we are doing that with the advantage of the many times we have engaged with this loss again and again and again over the years. And yet it is new this time. But that it's never a surprise that it's here again. That just like the idea that as we're moving through the seasons of the year, each year, we're not surprised when winter rolls around again every year, that it doesn't have to be and really shouldn't be a surprise when our grief resurfaces for us in these different moments. And so some of you maybe have seen this before, the idea of thinking about the spirals of time, the idea that we maybe cycle through nature, but thinking about this as something that does have some sort of upward movement, that does have, it's not staying identical each time. We're moving through with this knowledge and integration. So sometimes people talk about thinking of this as almost like a spiral staircase, where sometimes it feels like we're just moving in a circle. We're back to the beginning again, that we are feeling something with this huge intensity, or we've thought we were making progress and we feel thrust backwards. But that oftentimes what is happening is these normal and natural cycles, and there is movement that is happening, that is helping us, but it just may look a little bit different than that straight line that we are always expected. So when we really dig in a little bit more to thinking about some of these specifics about revisiting old losses, one concept that I think is really helpful is a concept that actually was introduced to introduce thinking about children, but that we find very helpful to think about across the entire lifespan. And this is about the idea of regrief. And regrief is a concept that they look at with children that has to do with developmental stages and understanding that when a child experiences a loss at a certain developmental stage, their brain has only developed to a place that allows them to have a certain understanding of that loss. So we know that children at certain ages don't fully understand the permanence of death, or they may not be at a place yet where they developmentally have the capacity to think about big existential questions or spirituality. And what they found was that unsurprisingly, when a child would lose a parent or a sibling, go through a significant loss at a certain developmental stage, when they would then reach the next developmental stage, they would suddenly be able to understand that loss in new ways. So their brain has continued to develop. They now have maybe a more complex understanding of morality and good and bad and right and wrong, or they're now suddenly able to ask questions that they wouldn't have even thought to ask before because they've moved on to this next developmental stage. And so they very naturally come back and they revisit their past losses through this new lens. And this new lens allows them to experience their loss in completely new ways. So what we find is that regrief is this very normal, natural, expected part of children growing up with losses, and that it is often really helpful when parents know to expect that and when kids know to expect that there's going to be these things that happen. But we oftentimes then, when we have losses in adulthood, I think underestimate the fact that this concept of regrief still is very much relevant. It might not be relevant in the same way of our brain developing for us to be able to conceptually now think about things in new ways that we didn't have the actual neurological capacity to think about before. But our world continues to change. We continue to move through developmental stages and milestones and events in our adult life, which cause us to understand the world differently, to understand ourselves differently, to have our identity shift, to have these many, many different new ways of being in the world. And that creates a regrief across the lifespan for us as adults. And the list is endless of the moments that we will have kind of a movement through the world that then feels like it is resurfacing an old loss in a new way, where we're suddenly thinking about things that we didn't even imagine at the time of the loss that we would ever think about or feel or experience. I welcome people to share their own examples of this in the chat. If you have had these moments, not just in early grief with things like sensory triggers, but sometimes many years later, we have those simple sensory triggers that bring things up. And when we think about that idea of, those analogies of the cycles of nature and the seasons, sometimes that is something that resurfaces old loss for us, where we suddenly are experiencing just the way that the air feels. We suddenly are experiencing the wind picking up in a storm that feels so similar to when the person we lost was sick, or what the day of the funeral was like. Any sort of things where we maybe every year notice that as I go into the autumn, or as flowers start blooming in the spring, that it brings up a sense memory of early grief, of the loss, of the time that they were sick, that is very much part of how we experience the world at that time. But then I think, as we think about milestones, about new life stages, the idea that if you had a partner who you always imagined that you would retire with, that a spouse where you had plans for retirement, and even if they died many years before retirement, now as you are approaching retirement or retiring, suddenly it may feel like it is resurfacing not just the memories of the plans that you had together, of the life that you imagined, but now it is bringing it up in new ways. You may be asking yourself questions about, is it a betrayal if now I decide what I want to do with my retirement looks different than the plans that we had? Or maybe it is wondering what advice they would give you now as you face decisions that are very different than the decisions that you talked about with them, or that you imagined that you would have. Maybe this is these stages that we find ourselves in, of becoming a parent if your parent died, and now suddenly you're experiencing things in the world that you allows you to understand what your parent must have experienced in ways that you never got to talk to them about. Now you're understanding challenges that they had as a parent to you. And this can suddenly start to bring up all sorts of feelings that go well beyond just, I wish I could ask them for advice, but instead brings up layers of feeling a new type of connection, a new type of kinship with this experience now that we both have as parents, that you're aware that you never will get to share with that parent when they're here. So that can hit with an incredible intensity that people often don't realize, or feel caught off guard by. I see some folks sharing here, yeah, getting married, thinking about is such a good example, and feeling like all of the things that you imagine that they would be there for. And again, this brings up very specific ideas of, what it would feel like if they were here, questions that we would have, all of these different things. I see Doris mention that I think is really common: new drugs advertised for a disease that took them in the past. Absolutely. When there are advancements in diseases, this is such a common one, right? This is like a new event that could have impacted how they lived, or and how they died, where there can be these huge mixed emotions around, of course, feeling glad for that advancement, but feeling such a profound pain that they didn't have that when they were here, and that it could have changed if the outcome potentially, if they were, that feels so intense. thinking about, selling the home that you were in for 33 years together and moving into a condo without them, right? This is so hard. And I think these are some of those moments where even in early grief, if we try to imagine, just like if in an illness, you had that anticipatory grief that very normal and natural. We try to imagine, what is it going to feel like when they're gone? What will it be like? And eat as much time as you spend with imagining that when someone actually dies, we realize there were just so many things we never could have imagined, no matter how much we tried. And, these types of events can be so similar as we continue to move through the world, even if in early grief we thought, wow, eventually I'll maybe sell this house and I'll have to move somewhere new without him. Trying to imagine that and then actually doing that are very, very different things. And so it brings up things with this deep intensity that I think I want to really highlight. Something that someone mentioned was feeling like, new losses open up old wounds that we thought were healing. And many of these events, whether it's new losses or just these new moments as we're moving through the world, it feels like it is reopening a wound, or it feels like maybe now we feel like, oh, I was making progress and now I've been thrown backwards. And I think one of the things that can be really important for us just in how we approach ourselves in these moments and we think about these moments is to think of them as new painful moments, but not moments that are throwing off some sort of linear progress that was supposed to be happening, or that somehow is, the same as a physical wound that gets, torn open again. But that is part of the experience of learning how to live in the world, that learning to live after loss, it is ongoing forever. And there are far more moments in early grief where we're having to learn to live in the world without them in foreign environments in new ways and thinking about these things. It is almost like how a child is learning to explore the world when they're young. We're like learning in our early grief so many different things. But as time passes, there are still going to be these countless learning moments that come up again. And that isn't a sign that we've undone anything or moved backwards or aren't making progress, but just that it is that continued, oops, I don't know how I did that and how to take that off. Apologies. That, it will, that we will, oh, sorry, I'm not sure what I did that triggered these on the screen, but let's see if I can, there we go. Hi, there we go. Okay. But that we can start to then, explore these, in these ways of noticing that this is a new learning that is happening, that is causing that pain. Absolutely, Lori, I think feeling that betrayal of feeling like moving forward and redefining myself without him, right? As our identity changes, this can absolutely feel like a betrayal. There can be that feeling of, if I'm allowing myself to evolve in the world and to move forward in the world, that somehow I am leaving behind the person who I was before, and therefore it can feel like I'm leaving them behind. And I think I see other people saying that they really, really relate to that. and, and saying that it isn't a betrayal. But I think one thing that's important when we think about it isn't a betrayal is trying to figure out what is it, right? What is it instead? And are there ways that we can understand that even as we change, that doesn't mean our connection to them has has been lost? I think sometimes that can be an important reminder that even as we're changing, it doesn't mean that we're leaving our memory of them behind. But also, thinking about the ways that as we continue to change and move through the world, that it can be a way that we are honoring the life that we have, that we're being able to feel like as part of our connection to them, our memory, the fact that their life was maybe shorter than we wanted or that we hoped, that we continue to try to live our lives fully, continue to try to be the best version of ourselves that we can be in this life that isn't the life we would have chosen, that can be something that we feel like is honoring our connection to them and to their life and to their loss. It might take a different shape, but I think it's part of it is asking that question of, if this feels like a betrayal, what is it about it? Is it feeling like I'm leaving them behind? Is it feeling like I don't know that they would like the person I'm becoming? Is it, but digging into that question, and maybe that's with a counselor or a therapist or a friend or in journaling, but finding ways to look at that about our identity, and then to find those reminders to the connections of how we're bringing that person with us, even as we're changing, how their memory is still there. But it is really, really hard, I think, to do that. It also is often just that it is hard. We wish we could go back to that person who we were before the loss, and that is one of the things that can be incredibly hard, is those changes in the identity. New relationships, in terms of just even all the people that we meet who didn't know them, who we wish could have met them, who we want to get to know them through our stories. But suddenly when we have these new people who maybe are part of our lives or part of our family, that, maybe if you've lost a child and your other child is now going through the milestones of getting married, and suddenly you're faced with not only this reminder of another child who will never have this experience, will not be here for this wedding, never got to be married themselves, but maybe you're welcoming someone into your family who never even got to meet that other child. And that all of these layers, right, that we have to peel back and say, of course, this has brought so much to the surface for me, and new losses that may remind us of old losses. Wow, I apologize, y'all. There are just like typos left and right in this presentation. I'm gonna have to to update this. So, with so many of these things, you may have spent lots of time, like I said, with in groups and counseling and journaling and talking to friends and doing this around so many things related to something that is coming up for you now. Maybe it is that suddenly anger has just resurfaced in a way where you felt like, wow, I really worked on that. And where has this come from? It's really surprised me. Or maybe it is suddenly that you're feeling guilt that you felt like you really worked through. And now one of these many types of events has come up, and it has brought it up in a new way. I think one quote that I always think is helpful to remember. It goes way, way back to ancient Greek philosophy again. No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man, right? When we do that work around some of the most painful pieces of our grief, whether that's the learning work of learning to live in the world in a certain way after loss, or to deal with certain really difficult emotions like anger, guilt, or resentment, and all of these things, that it is a certain version of us at a certain moment in time that is able to do that work and come to a place that maybe feels like we can exhale a little bit and feels like we've kind of closed a little bit of the chapter on that, the intensity of that emotion, or we've learned how to deal with this thing that was so hard after the loss. Because of that very linear idea of time and progress, and the idea of we're always supposed to be moving forward, and if we work through something, that's supposed to be the end of it, and then we continue to just grow and move forward, we often have the idea that, okay, once I've done that work once, it's supposed to be done. But I think if we take a step back and we remember that as we keep moving through the world, we're continuing to change. Our identity is changing. The world around us is changing. The people, our environment, maybe we have left the house and we've moved to the condo. We've moved to a whole new community. We have, new people who are part of our family. We're aging. We're dealing with our own health issues. We're all of these things that are happening. So oftentimes when things bubble up to this surface again, it's not because we didn't really deal with them well at the time. It's not because we didn't do the work, or that it hadn't really been a resolution that we found in that moment in the past when we really felt like we worked on it and hit a good place. But that as things change, we sometimes need to do this work again. We need to revisit at this moment with who I am now in the world, with the way that things have changed, with these new reminders that have come up for me, with this big life event. Maybe I need to go back. And one of the things that I think is so important is knowing that there is no timeline for which it is ever too late to seek out support and say, okay, do I want to talk to a therapist, or do I want to find a trusted friend who is going to understand, why this is surfacing for me so long later, or look for a group or an online space somewhere to be able to revisit this. Sometimes we feel like, oh, I shouldn't take up space for this, or is a counselor going to think it's weird that I want to come and talk about these things that are now coming up for me about a loss that happened so many years ago. But anyone who works in this space will, of course, tell you that this is incredibly common, that sometimes people realize I need to come back and I need to work on some of these things. So I think when we think about how do we cope in these moments when when we're approaching old losses, but through new moments in life, through changes in our identity, through, these shifts, what does it mean? What does it look like? I think, first of all, just that being open, right, to this idea of cycles, and maybe trying to let go of some of the linear ideas that go far beyond just where you've hopefully, that far beyond just the idea of stages of grief and things like that, but just to the idea that we are normally and naturally moving through different cycles in our lives all the time, and our grief comes and cycles with us, and that we're often moving through different seasons, and that it's okay to do that. That part of that is knowing that we might need to slow down and tend to our grief again. And that just like we needed to slow down and turn inward and maybe cocoon a little bit in the beginning days of early grief, and society normalized that and validated it, and you had people who surrounded you at the time, that you might need to give yourself a little more permission as time passes, because you won't have as much societal understanding all the time. But to be able to still ground in knowing that this is a normal and important thing to do when we move through transitions in life. And to continue, so kind of the analogy that, or using the idea of nature and the seasons, there is a book called Wintering by Catherine May that looks at and talks about this idea of how do we give ourselves more permission to slow down during different seasons and when things surface for us. She has a little bit more luxury and flexibility to slow down than some of us might, but I think still really invites us to think about what we can do to give ourselves that permission to just approach these moments with self-compassion from a place of non-judgment and self-kindness that looks at this as part of the expected trajectory of life after loss. It's not something that is a problem or an anomaly. It's just a moment where it's important that we give ourselves the same care we would have given ourselves in early grief, that we give ourselves that same understanding and know that this is often happening because it is a new moment of trying to live in the world after loss in a way or a place or with a person or with a different version of ourselves that is new, that has brought up something new, that like that regrief, it's almost a new developmental lens. And so it deserves the same level of kindness and care that you would have given yourself in the earlier days. And that it can be especially important to approach these moments with a little bit of curiosity. Sometimes it's very clear in some of the examples people shared in the chat, right? It might be really obvious why an older loss has resurfaced with this intensity. But sometimes it's not as obvious. Sometimes we hit a week or a season or an event or something that just brings our loss back out of nowhere, and we're not as sure about why it feels so hard. And these are the moments where it can be really important to remember that our emotions, our grief, our that all of those things are allies that are often giving us information about ourselves or about something that's happening, that sometimes it's important to sort of slow down and try and understand, what is this trying to tell me? What does this moment remind me of? Is there some point in the past? And that there are just questions and prompts that you might want to think about as just kind of inquiries for yourself, asking questions like, what does this remind me of? Is it another loss? Is it another developmental moment in my life? Is it another time that I felt scared or uncertain? Is there another moment that I can connect with this moment? Is this resurfaced grief that feels so intense in this moment, is it telling me something? Is it maybe making me aware that I had been rushing through and compartmentalizing? Sometimes it knocks us out of nowhere because we're going through that move out of the house and we're so focused on the practicalities and the logistics, and we feel like we just have to take care of everything, that we haven't made space to acknowledge the huge emotional pain of saying goodbye to a place that meant something to us with a person that we lost. And sometimes if we haven't created some space for that on our own, it will come and knock us over and make sure that we know that it's there. So maybe it is telling me that I need to slow down and make space to acknowledge the emotional pain in this moment and not just the logistics and the stressors. Um, as it resurfaces, as we, feel this grief with an intensity in a different moment, in a different place, asking questions, how does this feel similar to the way that it's felt in the past? And how does it feel different? Or how does it feel new? What scares me about just allowing this grief to come up without judgment, without trying to push it back, without saying, why is this here so intensely, even though it's been so long? And instead, just saying, okay, let me just welcome this in, because something about where I am in life and what's happening around me has brought this to the surface. And are there things that scare me about kind of letting it in and just tending to it, as I might have in earlier days? Asking that question of what would it look like to just make space for this grief that's coming up right now? What would it look like and how would it feel to just make some space for it now, even if maybe people around me don't understand it right now, or if it feels like a moment that I didn't expect it to be here. This may be also helpful to think about some prompts for others or for folks who are members of the hub. I posted some prompts, a number of other things earlier today about just autumn and this time of year, and some writing prompts. And this was one of them, the idea that if we think about how nature moves through different cycles of, cycles of birth and decay, or rest and renewal, and that movement, is it helpful to reflect on the ways that your grief has changed shape, or has cycled over time? Or have you noticed different seasons of your grief that you've moved through, but then maybe felt like you've come back around to again in ways that were both similar and different? And starting to maybe get a picture or mental image, or literally a creative image if you're somebody who draws or paints or writes, to just think about if there is another way to think about it, or something in the natural world that helps you to have an openness to grief, cycling and surfacing in different ways. So if you imagine your grief as nonlinear, how would you imagine it? What resonates more? Is it that, idea of a spiral? Is it something that looks more relational, like a web, or a constellation? Is it a landscape? But asking some of those questions for yourself, that maybe just gives yourself an openness and a self-compassion and non-judgment when these things come up, that then allows you to figure out how to best take care of yourself, and then how to reach out for support, and know that it's never too long or too late to be getting support for some of the emotions that are coming up with these older losses. So I appreciate the the folks sharing in the chat, and I completely agree that Christine, accepting that each grief journey is unique, and that the timelines and way we grieve are just so different. So I think that you being able to have that openness is so important for others, and to ourselves, to just being able to see it that way. I also appreciate, I see, some folks in the chat, but I think it is so important to remember that that temptation to compare losses and types of grief, that we as human beings, unfortunately, we fall into comparison mode all the time. But we all have such unique relationships with the people we've lost for so many different reasons. And it makes it impossible for us to be able to compare. So I appreciate folks sharing in the chat. So I hope this, it was just kind of a little food for thought today, this topic of old losses and, how and why they come up. This isn't something, as compared to, I think some of we often love digging into the research in these webinars and thinking about what we know from lots of the mental health research. And I think this topic today is one where it isn't necessarily something where there's a lot of research here about when this happens, why this happens, how this happens, or how to cope. But we share just from our experience of working with so many people over the years and seeing some of the ways that our own self-compassion and willingness to just create space for the grief when it does surface in new moments and in new ways, and ask from that place of curiosity and get the support we need, that really is what can go a really long way. So I hope this was just at least a little food for thought, even if it was a little less steeped in the research than some of our other webinars are. We will send the replay is available actually at the link that you joined this tonight. So if you want to go back and revisit any of it, it'll be available at that link for at least 7 days, oftentimes longer. And if you're a member of the hub, it'll be in the webinar library indefinitely. So you can find that there. We'll also be sending out just a little information, the Finding Your Way course that we offered for the first time at the beginning of this year, which is for folks who are a little further out from their loss, that is kind of about rebuilding when you get past the first year and are maybe in that second year and beyond and still feeling kind of lost in that identity and rebuilding place. We will be sending out an email that we're going to start a new round of that 12-week course in the middle of November. It'll start, I think, November 9th. So stay tuned if you were waiting for us to be offering that again. I know some people have been asking. And as always, thanks so much for joining and for sharing. If our next month webinar, Mary just put the link in the chat, is going to be about grief at the holidays. And and you can join there. And then Mary's also shared some information about the Griever Hub. So thanks so much, everybody, and have a good evening.